Morning, everyone. I'll be chairing today's session, the first session, theme one, the global conjuncture, crisis, and possibilities for transformation. Our three speakers today are Mazibuko, Jara, Michelle Williams, and Vishwas Satgar. And I will be giving everyone 15 minutes to present. I think that's an adequate amount of time. And now we've got our first speaker, Mazibuko.
Thank you, comrades. I've got a few apologies to start with. One, I won't be able to share my screen because that will then affect my internet access and strength. I may even lose connection. That's just the state of rural internet facilities. Um, and then secondly, I thought I would have prepared my think piece by now, which I have not. Uh, I just had a tough week from last Friday, so my apologies, comrades, in that regard. But I'll be finalizing it after tomorrow. Um, and then the last apology is linked to the second. Initially, I thought I would be speaking on the broad idea of a left party, but taking it in a particular direction. I have a particular scheme which I want to present. So I'll come back to that scheme, but I'll start with a focus on the topic for this session, the current conjuncture globally, and what it poses as possibilities for deep change, um, call it transformation. I think it's always useful to talk about the global conjuncture from a local perspective. In our case, we are all in the South African polity. So when we approach the global discussion, I think it's always useful to start with that. But at the same time, without actually forgetting dynamics, forces, perspectives, and lessons from elsewhere. Um, Further, I think we would all agree that globally, the current state of the left and popular forces is not uh, of the kind required to effectively respond to the crisis, to expose the weaknesses and the crisis ridden nature of what the governments across the world are doing, but also the accumulation agendas that they protect and promote. And this has become even more apparent if we look at what the pandemic and the lockdowns have done almost across the world. As Vish was saying, the mutation of neoliberalism is partly due to its own bankruptcy because it basically fails to meet people's needs across the globe. Of course, in some countries, there would have been particular moments of economic growth, but those even those trajectories of growth did not ultimately result in well-being, whether that well-being was in jobs or better services and so on, and that came through in many countries as they tried to combine a range of measures, whether it was some limited stimulus to the economies, but ultimately, what comes through is that packaged with that is rising austerity, but also what is going to be important in the coming period is going to be the search for restoring profitability, given how the lockdown and basically the pandemic, and of course other structural dynamics in the global economy have meant low growth. Um, yes, I've seen figures which suggest some particular individuals making huge amounts of profit in this period, but ultimately, if you look at beyond those individuals, looking at major companies, there's clearly going to be a need to restore profitability given the hits that have been that have been worsened. And I think that restoration of profitability, we can already see it at least on three fronts: increasing extractivism, and as such, the interest, for example, from the masks of this world on Bolivian lithium, but beyond that, basically the ongoing search for mineral and other natural resources. For example, if you look at Sudan, part of the revolution we saw over the last 2 years there was about national sovereignty, because the Sudan basically has been parceled up and bought over by countries from Europe, countries from the Middle East, and the US, China, and Russia, and even India as well. Partly because the Sudan is a vast territory with massive natural resource capacity, and also from the perspective of food production, it's also quite being close to the Nile. Actually, the Nile runs through the Sudan. So that's just an example of increasing extractivism as part of a global search for a global capture of resources for accumulation purposes. So extractivism will be the one key arena, in my view, that's going to continue in the search for accumulation. We've already even before COVID, there was quite a shift and a focus to the fourth industrial revolution in ways that uh, clearly are about maximizing profits, minimizing labor, instead of using technology in a way that advances social progress, whether it's about uh, universalizing access to goods and services that would ordinarily be difficult to access. That's going to continue. It's got this strange feature though of a colonial tendency. If you look at this ongoing search, space exploration, and what it means for the possible colonization of other planets, it's taking a very strange and actually grotesque turn in that regard. Um, However, what I think may delay it somewhat may be the levels of investment required to make it profitable to convert advanced economies on a massive scale. But at the same time, the push in that direction may just be spurred further, though, by the same crisis that has been worsened by the lockdown. What I've not seen very clearly in stuff I've been looking at is whether we are set for another round of further financialization. Uh, those the few individuals who were mentioned as having made profits, those profits primarily come from further gimmicks in the games they play with financialization. How basically hoarding money by nine financial firms and basically using money they have in various financial transactions just to expand profits. And also that will be linked in our South African context, well, broadly Southern context, to illicit financial flows, capital flight, which has happened, particularly in the African instance, and those monies are not flowing to productive investment. I foresee that these three tendencies are likely to be a major feature of the next period in terms of the global economic system, triggered by the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown. But at the same time, what we've seen coming through very clearly uh, is the importance of the public good, the importance of the commons. For example, the TAC is the Treatment Action Campaign is proposing an important campaign for decommodified access to the vaccine, which scientists are in the search for COVID-19 vaccine. But that raises a very interesting question. Yes, you can advance a demand for decommodification, but to be delivered under what public health system? So that's why I'm saying globally, the question of the public good of the commons of decommodification is coming through very clearly. Unfortunately, what we are not seeing in any detail, whether from progressive governments as limited as they are, or from mass movements, are clearly formulated political demands that shape the public discourse, that even tilt the balance of forces. So this TAC campaign, I think, could be an important uh, uh, striking match that can reignite popular campaigning around the notion of the public good, around commodification. And as I'm saying, it can take it back to the question of the public health system, which would be interesting because it could raise a whole range of things that can begin to roll back, at least in some countries, the impact of neoliberalism on public goods. Also, what we've seen in response to COVID-19, which had been in existence unevenly in South America, in parts of Asia, to some extent, to some lesser extent in parts of Africa. People organizing consciously around alternatives from below, whether it's cooperatives, whether it's alternative seed systems, whether it's organizing around food sovereignty, or even in some instances, schooling or even local transport. Those have gained some kind of traction, given how the governments have failed. What is missing for me in these emerging alternatives from below is still the fact that even on a country level, in different parts of the world, they are not yet reaching a critical mass, and even at country level, such that they are a real current that that shows the way forward, that galvanizes forces, and that can change things in a systemic and structural sense. Uh, so comrades, I'm moving then to my additional point in this regard. I don't think we can consider the current context globally without also thinking about what is normally referred to as geopolitics. Uh, we're seeing in the US this strange transition from Trump to Biden. Well, I think it will happen, as I think all of us think it will do. But what will be interesting for me will be the likely trajectory of the Biden led imperialism as it seeks to reinsert itself into a more acceptable phase globally. How will it play? What will be the power play, given, for example, the threats it is facing in its alignments in India and in Brazil in particular? Of course, in the Middle East, the US remains quite dominant, but its key planks of allies in India and Brazil, I don't think, are necessarily so secure in power in the medium to long term. Uh, the strike in India over the last 2 days was very interesting in terms of shaking the power that Modi has. That will have implications for how far the US then can project its power, can seek to redirect what happens in the global economy in the interest of its corporations. And of course, there is the almost silent but also quite open continuing strategic positioning by China and its corporations, many of them being state-owned corporations, and also the role of U.S. debt and the other U.S. economic ties to the Chinese economy. The U.S., as much as it will seek to reassert itself, and I think it will be doing so in a more confined, in a more what's the word? Not confined, in a more restrictive space globally. Not with the same room for maneuver and influence as there was in the early phases of the neoliberal period. What I'm less clear about, which I think is requires our collective analysis, is what is happening in Europe in terms of the different major economies in Europe themselves, because the responses there were very interesting. If you look at what Germany did, the measures it took to respond to COVID, does that mean a significant shift in the policy orientation? Of course, does not necessarily change the accumulation regime, but at the same time, it's starkly different from a typical neoliberal response. I think Europe it requires quite a bit of attention from us because it's much more than the US because there's a longer history there of public goods and more set patterns of public goods, even though they were shaken by the neoliberal period. So that will be very interesting for me because if popular forces in Europe can push further around the return of public goods, that could have some significant implications for how European companies, European capital behave in different parts of the world, and of course how that will play up in the geopolitical space as well. So comrades, I think what we need to do in thinking about the global context is how then there is no real project from the South, particularly from the African continent, that uh, opens up space for a bit more sovereignty and the possibilities of what Amir would refer to as delinking. There was the Mbeki project, which did punch way above its weight, but within a neoliberal frame. And there was then the Venezuelan-led project around building particular economic logics that were, despite the rhetoric, were quite flawed and were soon exposed to be limited. So there is no real project from the South, either from governments, either from movements of a sufficient scale that can show us the possibilities that can let us imagine. So this remains for me a major gap in terms of how far we can try to think and act in the global space. This is not to undermine the need for struggle, the need for solidarity, the need for an international perspective. But at the same time, I think we will have to be realistic about the possibilities for how far we can go, even more so in our African context. If, for example, you look at what is happening currently in Ethiopia or what is emerging in Mozambique, apparently the wars that are being threatened there are linked to the discovery of natural resources, particularly gas, and what that means for the region. So again, we're likely to see a kind of a Sudan being repeated in Southern Africa with different imperial interests competing over these resources in a context where we've got weak states, where we've got weak regional integration, and even more so the absence of a radical politics that informs even the interests that those states are driving or even regional efforts are representing. So then, for me, all of this takes me to my scheme about what the global context means for the left. Uh, we're very far from where we should be. We do need to imagine how we can build an ecosystem for a renewed left and a renewed broader working class politics and set of forces. We yes, imagine that on a global scale, but starting domestically. And domestically, I think it's possible to imagine what that ecosystem could look like. Ultimately, such an ecosystem will not necessarily lead us to the point of the working class taking over power, but it can lead us to the point where the working class is sufficiently rebuilt, sufficiently reignited, sufficiently re-strengthened to be a factor in society. For me, I think we have to be much more modest than imagining taking power as our particular formulations of the past would necessarily lead us to, and then to reposition the working class into that position, into that possibility. I think there are five elements in my scheme. One, clearly, there's a need for mass movements. that are diverse, that solve people's issues, that are concrete, but also as they deal with the immediate and the concrete, they also connect that in a conscious way to the kind of systemic and structural changes that are required, including the question of political power. Mass movements across a whole range of concern, whether it is youth, whether it is women, whether it is land, ecology, workers, and so on. The material is ready for that. And as we know, there is just not sufficient existence of such a web of life of mass movements across the board. In my view, the notion of a left party has to be very it has to be rooted in that kind of process of rebuilding mass movements. That's the one pillar in my scheme. I'll move quickly through the other pillars. The other pillar, in my view, is going to be culture and media, particularly when you consider in the African context how heritage, culture, and other elements are actually used both by statist forces and also traditionalist forces to do several things, to exercise social control, to delineate power, but also at times as avenues for accumulation. And culture and media, in my view, are very important to connect with where people are and in ways that can move them into action. Linked to that will be knowledge. What knowledge is produced? How do we shape discourses in ways that lend people to progressive politics, that tend people to progressive politics? We're still living too much of knowledge, whether it's research, whether it's stuff in the media, whether it's stuff that's produced for general consumption, that is still produced in ways that basically perpetuate and do not challenge systems of accumulation. Then the other pillar for me, fourth pillar, is then this work that has emerged, particularly these community action networks, the food distribution groups, the food gardens, as well as even local education systems. There are seeds of alternatives there, but they are still looking at the local, which is important, but the local, in my view, has to be connected to why actually do we not have food? Why actually is our education system bad? Why actually are people still cramped in poor public transport? And in that regard, this is where then the international aspect becomes important because elsewhere, I think there's advancement in the sophistication, in the logics, and also in the systemic approaches. If you look at Kerala, if you look at what is happening in Rojava and some parts of Latin America in terms of how movements are conceptualizing alternatives. Of course, it's present in the African context where there's been regional efforts to build regional movements, but it's still far from what is required. And the task for me, for us as the left in this regard, is to find a way to connect those active in these areas with the broader discourses. The last point of my scheme, which I think can help South African forces to reposition domestically and globally, is going to be the massive need for activist education on a sustained basis. We do not have a critical mass of activists who understand issues in a particular way. We've got the ability analytically, programmatically, politically, organizationally to connect the complexities and contribute to movements that are informed in that way. So ultimately, my scheme that I'm presenting as part of contributing to changing the global conjuncture and taking the possibilities for transformation forward is my scheme is not possible without a serious and sustained attention to activist education in a deep sense. That also goes beyond your classics, but that also enables imagination, that enables people to bring the experiences they have from life, basically living under capitalism, to bear, but also in ways that help them to be actors. If you look at the Amadiba Crisis Committee, they've traveled quite a path from 2002 to now, when they were just concerned about losing land, to now connecting their struggle for land to both a critique of capitalism, but also the need for alternatives. They are now getting more confident, getting more clearer about the importance of a food economy compared to the promises of mining jobs. That has taken some 18 years for them to get there, and without necessarily a sustained program of political education. I'm using that example of the Amadiva crisis community to underline how basically there's actually material on the ground we can work with as the left, where we can advance education, but also connect that education to a broader schema of what needs to be done. In that sense, then, we can indeed build working class forces to the point of challenging the balance of power domestically, but in a way that also then contributes to the re-strengthening, to the rebuilding of global left forces.
Sorry.
Because I'm concluding, because remember, South Africa, despite its limitations, remains important in the African continent, but also in the global South. So what we do domestically matters for everywhere. Thanks, comrades. Sorry for taking long.
Okay, so I'm going to try to stick to time. I have a fair amount to go through. First, I want to apologize. I know that I was supposed to send a short paper and I have not yet done so. And trust me, I'm getting reminded of this a few times a day. And I don't have the option of turning it off, like I'm just ignoring an email. So I will send you guys something. I focused on doing a PowerPoint today, but I will send a shortened version. Okay, so the theme was the crisis and possibilities for transformation. And what I work on and what I care a lot about is democracy. So I decided to focus on capitalism and democracy today. So democracy is in crisis, and it's in crisis around the world. We're seeing this in the global South and in the global North, whether it's the US, India, I mean, Mazibuko mentioned some of the places, Brazil, Russia, Zim, it's in crisis, and the crisis might vary slightly in each place, but it is in crisis everywhere. But what I'm going to argue today is that this crisis of democracy is not just a political crisis on its own. It is a broader crisis. If we just fix the politics, if we just get better politics in place, we're not going to change the fundamental problems of today. And that's because it's a political crisis of a broader crisis, a multifaceted crisis of capitalism. So we're currently experiencing, when I say a broader multifaceted, we're experiencing financial crisis, economic crisis, ecological crisis, social crisis, as well as political crisis. And so together, these various strands of crises add up to a general crisis. In other words, we're experiencing a crisis of capitalism. And I don't say that lightly. I know we always talk about crises and crisis of capitalism, but there's really been 4 major crises of capitalism in the last 250 years. So we are experiencing a more general crisis of capitalism. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go over, there's been 4 major historical periods of capitalism. I'll go over the first 3 very, very briefly so I can spend more time on the 4th, our current. The first is mercantile capitalism that started in the 15th century, but really develops in the 17th and 18th century and becomes the dominant mode of production. This period was characterized by merchants, enclosures of public goods. This goes back to a lot of what Mazibuko was talking about. We have the enclosures of public goods and commons, the creation of working classes, the racialized and gendered norms of control, and territorial expansion. Non-human nature was conquered and expropriated from the public and the commons in the interest of production. The realm of social reproduction, basically care work, was left on its own, and states were involved in enclosures, transforming land, labor, and money into commodities. One of my favorite books is Polanyi's Great Transformation, and he talks about how these 3 commodities come into being. They had to be created as commodities, and the state was crucial in that. The second period of capitalism is laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century, and it is a regime of liberal competitive capitalism. Here we had the industrial exploitation in the European core, which combined with colonial expropriation in the periphery. So non-human nature becomes central to accumulation as energy resources are exploited across the world through territorial expansion. And for instance, it's at this time that coal and oil are turned into energy for industrial production during this period. Racialized forms of control increased through colonialism, and workers were left to reproduce themselves autonomously outside productive wage. When I say reproduce themselves, I'm talking about the gendered work in the home. That's the social reproduction that happens to create us as human beings. States looked on from the sidelines, but did not protect people from the ravages of capitalism. Then the third period of capitalism is state-managed monopoly capitalism of the 20th century. And this period is based on large-scale industrial production and domestic consumerism in the core, underpinned by ongoing colonial and post-colonial expropriation in the periphery. Non-human nature continues to be expropriated. Oil becomes dominant, the dominant energy form. The coal continues to be important, especially in countries like South Africa. And social reproduction is internalized into the system. So that's a huge shift. It becomes internalized into the system through state and corporate provision of social welfare. We start seeing social welfare developing at this time. It promotes the idea of the family wage, even though very few families ever get to achieve this, but it promotes this idea. So this is now becoming part of what we think capitalism will provide. Okay, so then the fourth stage, a fourth period, and it's our current period, and I'm going to spend most of the time talking about this, is financialized, globalized neoliberal capitalism that began in the 1980s. This regime relocated manufacturing to low-wage regions, recruited women into the paid workforce in mass, and promoted state and corporate disinvestment from social welfare. The limits of exploitation of nature are increasingly being reached during this period, and this is resulting in human-induced climate change. Care work is externalized again. We go back to externalizing care work into the family, onto the families and communities, but it's ironic that their capacity to perform this has been weakened, with now both people having to be wage earners. So both the woman and man are now wage earners, and unlike the two periods before where the women were still at home, now you have women working, but also having to do care work. So the result of this neoliberal period is rising inequality, climate change, a dualized organization of social reproduction with basically those who can pay for help and those who cannot. Okay, so in each period of capitalist production, there have also been different institutional forms and different normative orders and values. So different institutional forms, meaning different state capacity, different types of states, and also regulatory regimes, and also values and norms that come to dominate. In each period, there have been different social contradictions of capitalism as well. So it's not that all capitalism produces a homogeneous type of contradiction. Each period generates its own forms of contradiction. So the social contradictions have incited different forms of social struggle. Class struggle is always there, but it's also accompanied by what we call boundary struggles, both of which were entwined with other struggles, such as emancipating women, slaves, colonized peoples. All of these are struggles that then come into different periods. So, what slide am I on? How do I know it's, okay, good. In each period, so each period gave rise to political turmoil. So mercantile capitalism was eventually destroyed by slave revolts in the peripheries and democratic revolutions in the core metropolitan areas. Laissez-faire had 150 years of political turmoil that included socialist revolutions, fascist governments, 2 world wars, and many anti-colonial struggles. State-managed monopoly capitalism experienced anti-colonial struggles, the new global left, movements, Cold War, and nuclear arms race before it was eventually supplanted by our current regime of financialized, globalized neoliberal capitalism. So to repeat, capitalism is a mode of production, which means it's the way we organize economic relations, and it has been the dominant form of economic activity for about 250 years. And that in these 250 years, there's been 4 major periods. Each is based on its own different forms of organizing, social relations, and state involvement. And each period generated crises that resulted in different types of political contestation, which shapes the reorganization. The type of political contestation shapes the reorganization of capitalism into the next period. Okay, so we are currently living through the crisis generated by financialized, globalized neoliberal capitalism. So I'm saying something more than this, though. Capitalism, I've just said, is an economic system, but it is only partly about the economy. Capitalism is also much more than just production and economic relations. It is also about how we relate to non-human nature, to social reproduction, to public power. And when I talk about public power, I'm actually talking about the state. So these are non-economic realms that capitalism depends on for its survival. These are the background conditions of capitalism. So background conditions of capitalism, that might be something new to some of you. So we most often think of the narrow view of capitalism, that it is an economic system with an economic growth as its system imperative. It monetizes value, it has profits as a driving motive, and workers and owners meet in the realm of production. Mainstream economists and business people see it this way. Traditional Marxists also see it as an economic system, and Marx analyzed class struggle in the realm of production. So for traditional Marxists, it is a relationship of exploitation based on surplus value, which means wages are not exchanged for equivalents for labor power, that defines capitalism. And I don't disagree with any of this. This is all true, but this is only part of the story. Capitalism, to use Nancy Fraser's concept, is much more what I've just described as the economic. This is the front story. Oh, I'm halfway through. Yo. I need to move. I'm gonna, oh my God. Okay, sorry, okay. I'm told I'm taking too long. All right, so I just need to get this part straight, because I want to just make sure that everybody understands. Capitalism is also much more. There's a background story. The background story is social reproduction, basically unwaged labor for caring. Secondly, it's non-human nature. It's this large fund of free gifts that capitalism just takes from nature. And it is the expansion of territory, first in the global north and then across the globe. So it's also about expropriation from peoples, first in global north and then through colonialism. And it's also about public power in the state that provides these background conditions. Okay, so what I'm saying is that these background conditions also generate struggle. So it's not just struggle it's not just a classical Marxist understanding that we have class struggle in the realm of production. It's also very much in these other arenas. Struggles have emerged not just about production, but the boundary struggles limiting the economy's control over society and social reproduction, over nature, expansion to other territories and colonialism, and political power and the state. So political crisis, the crisis of democracy, the one about political power in the state, is the one that I'm most concerned with and will focus on today. And this is because if we don't resolve democracy, if we do not save democracy, if we do not make sure that we recapture democracy, none of the other things are possible, and I'll explain why. Okay. I'm not going to talk about I'm just going to assume everybody knows what financialized, globalized, neoliberal capitalism means. But I want to say it's not just about all the economic stuff. It also is about I said norms and values of each period. This is where everything gets assigned economic metrics, including non-human life. So we trade in clean air, we trade in the environment. All of these things, what shouldn't be commodities, are now given economic metrics. At university, we're often asked, what value does a social science degree? What can I do with it, right? These are all ways of seeing something in economic terms. Okay, so, oh my goodness, market democracy. Okay, what has happened in our period is that the state has been captured by these neoliberal forces, and corporations now in a market democracy, what I'm calling market democracy, corporations have more power than states. The interests of corporations and their political and economic ruling elites are collapsed into national interests. corrupt parties and states become more and more dominant. And it cuts all of these things, as well as the values of economic metrics assigned to everything, these cut at the very substance of democracy. And we see this in the rise of violent, intolerant, and exclusionary politics. And we see it in the growing authoritarianism happening around the world. And we even see it, though, in South Africa. There's lots of ways in which the ANC has undermined democracy. One of the and Mazibuko, you can talk more about this, but the traditional leadership bill that reinforces traditional forms and patriarchal forms of power in the rural areas is also one of the subtle ways in which this is happening. Okay, so, but democracy, why do I say it's so important? You know, is it worth saving? I think there's a lot of people on the left that actually have basically said, well, actually existing democracy is a failure and we should get rid of it. There is that debate that happens. But I want to argue that democracy is actually crucial. It's the only form of government that is ruled by and for the people. And it is not corporatocracy, it's not monarchy, it's not dictatorship, it's not fascism, it's not vanguardism, which is ruled by an elite within a political party. And it is the only form that actually gives the potential, and I want to emphasize potential, in its theory that we can have rule for and by the people in our own interests. So this is, and it's the only form of rule that actually allows for this. So what is democracy? Rule by and for the people, not rule by others. And there's two essential components to democracy: administrative capacity and public legitimacy. And there's two primary principles of democracy, and that's equality and liberty. And I'm going to go through each one of these very, very, very quickly. So, components of democracy, administrative capacity. And I want us to reflect on, when we talk about state failure in the South African case, this is what they failed at. And this is now why our democracy is being undermined, one of the reasons. So administrative capacity is crucial because you develop and implement laws and public policy in the interest of the public. You steer economic activity in the interest of society, and you protect the natural world, support social reproduction, and you ensure democratic public institutions for people's participation. These ensure private interests, such as large corporations and the economic and political elite, comply with state regulation, and there's financial accountability of public funds. This is a fundamental component. Administrative capacity is a fundamental component to have a vibrant, capable democracy that is operating in people's interests. But you also need public legitimacy. The public must believe that this other stuff is happening. And this is where arenas for public to engage the state around public interest and voice public opinions about the state's regulations. You have to have robust, organized, engaged, and informed citizenry. So we shouldn't take that lightly. I think the US, one of the things that I've been really grappling with is, how did 70-something million people vote for Trump? And it's this point: robust, organized, engaged, and informed citizenry has been eroded in the US. So you have populist, authoritarian sensibility because people have lost the democratic sensibility. And it's crucial that we are educated into being democratic citizens. You also have active political participation by a wide range of constituents through civil society organizations, trade unions, local government institutions, participatory forums, open, free, and fair media. And all of these are crucial in ensuring financial accountability and transparent participatory budgeting, policymaking, and implementation. So the more transparency, the more participation from the public, the more you get legitimacy. And so when the state closes down these spaces, or we're not allowed to discuss the national level budget, when all of those things happen, those are all erosions of democracy. So public legitimacy is a crucial component: administrative capacity and public legitimacy. Okay, but you also have two principles of democracy. One is a narrow view, and that sees liberty as non-interference, where the state does not interfere with economic activity. It basically creates the conditions for economic activity, but it doesn't come to protect people. And you also have equality. The understanding of equality is equality of opportunity, that everyone has equal opportunity. This slide, thanks to Jane and Courtney, I have this slide on a PowerPoint. This is liberal democracy, where you have equality and liberty. Everybody is standing on, there's equality, everybody's on the box equally, but you can see the outcome is not equal. You have the little guy who can't see over the fence, the tall guy who sees really well, and the middle guy who kind of sees. But there's no state intervention, so it's liberty as non-intervention. Then we have a more expansive view of these principles, and here you have liberty and as protection from arbitrary rule and power, from domination by others. So you actually have a state that intervenes to protect. Liberty is about a protection, not just your non-interference. And you have equality of outcomes, not just equality of the starting place. So the second one is where you have state intervention. So liberty of intervening, and you have different size boxes so that the outcome is equality on this other side. That now is a more expansive understanding of democracy's two primary principles: equality of quality of outcomes and liberty as interference against domination. Okay, but the narrow view triumphed over the 20th century. Capitalist centers promoted this illusion of virtuous cycle between democracy and capitalist development, and they got away with it in the global north because they outsourced the underbelly of capitalism, the expropriation, the exploitation, all of that to the colonial periphery. But central to this was also the narrow view of democracy, which then was about voting in elections and not people's participation, which as legitimacy requires much more engaged participation. Okay, I'm gonna skip who are the people because I don't think I have time. It's just you can, and I think this is what's going on in the US right now, is exclusively conceived. Also in South Africa, the retreat, the xenophobic stuff, all of this is exclusively conceiving who are the people to inclusively, there's inclusive notions. But this has important implications to how we understand public interest and who is elected to represent us. So who we define as the people is crucial for our understandings of democracy. It also produces negative and positive forms of solidarity. So we have exclusionary categories of race, gender, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, nationality. These things divide people, they reinforce inequalities and hierarchies of power, but there's also positive solidarities, and this is about shared humanness, of equality of all social, economic, and ecological justice. It rejects othering of people, and I think this is a lot of the counter movements you're seeing, people trying to take over and redefine what citizenship is. And we build common ground around diverse groups. It's a common humanity. Okay. So an expansive, robust, overcomes economic and political divide, political power in the state, in the interest of society, and the economy is re-embedded in the interest of society. So if the economy doesn't operate independent, that front story and the back story, it actually has to now be openly engaged in the back story grounds, and we control that relationship. And a expansive, robust democracy would foreground social reproduction and non-human nature. So we would foreground the needs to meet social reproduction and protect nature. And it moves beyond Marxist understanding of the realm of necessity by laying the basis of the realm of freedom, by reorienting the relationships between these background, foreground positions. I have a wonderful quote from Rosa Luxemburg that I will not share. Well, I'll give it to you later. I know, Vish and Awanda are getting after me. Okay. I just wanted to, on the possibilities, very, very briefly. There is a lot of possibilities. There are a lot of exciting stuff happening all over the world, and I've just listed them. Cooperative forms of production, consumption, finance, participatory budgeting, local community-owned energy grids, alternative currencies, transition towns, local food movements. And these are all recalibrating these inter-realm boundaries with the economy. So economy and social reproduction, all of these different inter-realm boundaries are getting recalibrated in many of these experiments. And so Vish and I have been studying this stuff for the last 12 years, trying to find these experiments around the world. And we've been amazed at how much creativity and experimentation is going on. So this is just some stuff in Italy. I just have a bunch of pictures. Italy, this is in Venezuela. These are all cooperative production forms and community-based food movements. This is in Ivory Park. This is BITS, our food sovereignty center. I love that picture, guys. This was I think the climate justice charter was a really important part of this visioning and trying to get something new. That's it. Thanks. Sorry, I spoke so fast.
All right. Thanks. I'm not going to waste time. So the piece I shared with the group, I was invited to write it for the International Sociological Association. It's titled "After Capitalism, Democratic Eco-Socialism?" ? I mean, it's really about trying to make the case for democratic eco-socialism as a political project. It's also trying to bring into sharp focus the fault lines running through global ruling classes as well. And maybe finally, talk about the kind of end game of capitalism and the kind of points of resistance that will ferment and engender a democratic eco-socialist project. So, I mean, I've never done this, Jane. I need to see this thing, so that I'm going to read a bit of it just quickly and embellish here and there as I go. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So in the contemporary life world of capitalism, we have gas-guzzling automobiles, high-tech airplanes, container ships, energy using skyscrapers, weapons of mass destruction, all weapons of mass destruction in the context of carbon-centric social relations, and particularly as climate change increases and is accelerated by the use of these. So capitalism has ruptured the Earth system. This is what's fundamentally new about where we are. And it's all about constructing a capitalist nature that's patriarchally domesticated, scientifically observed and managed. And really the kind of techno-fix coming to the fore in the context of this capitalist anthropocentrism is geoengineer it all. We are the apex species, capitalism is here, it's dominant, and then let's kind of store this carbon in the deep recesses of the earth. And of course, this techno-fix means that it continues business as usual. So the oil spigots remain open, sort of carbon-based accumulation continues until this resource is used up. So the logic of contemporary capitalism is not just about dispossession, but it's also about ecocide, obliterating the planetary conditions that sustain human and non-human life on planet Earth. Marx talks about it as the metabolic rift, and Rosa talks about it as the conquest of the natural economy. So after more than 3 decades of neoliberalization, I mean, where have we come to? So capital has been given all the conditions for accumulation on its terms. So property rights have now become all about the sovereignty of capital. So, corporations can now sue governments for loss of profits. I mean, that's what the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement was all about, and so on, including the transatlantic one. The WTO locks in a lot of this in terms of property rights, etc. Greedy plutocrats use power in different parts of the world in a very instrumentalized way just to advance their interests. And there's hyper-individualism. So the subject of contemporary capitalism is the Americanized nihilistic capitalist subject. So you consume, you shop, you indebt yourself, etc. But this is not where it's stopping. I mean, currently bio and digital tech capital are all about the transhuman. And that's the vision, the technotopian vision coming out of Silicon Valley and so on. And we have a shallow version of it in South Africa called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. But it shares these assumptions, actually. So essentially, there is no common cause with humanity. Capital today is completely, if you like, against humanity and nature. That's what we're dealing with, all right? And this is in the absence of enemies. So the Soviet socialism is gone. The working class is weakened and precariatized across the planet. Nature is conquered by capital, and history is actually ended in their paradigm. they prevail. So there's no left bogeys, there's no left scapegoats, but yet we have this rise of a new right-wing and neo-fascist progeny of this neoliberal order, and we're seeing it in different parts of the world: Washington, Brasilia, Delhi, Moscow, etc. So it stands ready to brutally crush any that challenges this utopia, and it's using and evoking all kinds of racialized tropes: the migrant, the black person, the Muslim, the indigenous, and other overinflated terror threats. So it's misdirecting publics. These regimes are deeply authoritarian. They're about militarized violence to defend the normalcy of capitalism. And basically, we need to nuance this a little bit. Authoritarian regimes are not new in modern history, but authoritarian regimes, even when they use brazenly the monopoly of violence, are never able to completely pacify societies. There's always limits. We even had that here, okay? Despite the high levels of militarization of our struggle, there was still resistance, if you like. So in this context also, you know, the US military understands that it cannot control a world in climate chaos. So since 2015, after we overshot a 1 degree Celsius increase in planetary temperatures, the world, the period of climate chaos has been inaugurated. Okay, and that's going to be defining of the world we live in. But the US military understands, and I've studied this, they cannot control the world, even with the United States being ravaged left, right, and center. Okay, so they cannot be in permanent war. Let's put it that way. Okay, they understand it, and it's an unwinnable war to control the planet in the context of climate chaos. So war also requires scarce resources, and it's costly, and that also brings limits. Nuclear weapons, and we've learned this in the 20th century, the prospect of mutual annihilation puts limits to that as well. That's not to say, of course, that they aren't lunatics who want to use these weapons and so on, but there are objective limits to all of this. But basically, the hegemonic moment of neoliberalism is over, and the demos, the people, are restless and desperate. COVID-19 has brought this into sharp relief. Suffering has been exacerbated. The depth of suffering has been worsened, and so on. So the democratic subject in this context is looking at the world. We all, if you like, are looking at the world all the time and trying to understand what's going on. And we use this vantage point of sort of full spectrum gaze to marvel at the idiocy of global ruling classes, the clumsiness of autocrats, and of course, we get insights into street power and subaltern resistance. So capitalism is using the neo-fascist option. It has begun to do that. It's weaponizing the digital sphere. But again, this is happening at the intersection of mass resistance as well. This is not just happening according to their script, if you like. And so this is where democracy and socialism will thrive, in my view. And this goes back to even Michelle's presentation of what's there beneath the surface, the undergrowth of profound democratic impulses on the planet. So we're at a point where ecocide is now capitalism's end game. So to pick up on that point about the fourth great crisis of capitalism, there have been these four crises, but this particular crisis is about the end of everything, including capitalism. So the capitalist ecocide is on the march, and this is what's if you like ironic about this moment, or rather perplexing. I mean, why is neo-fascism on the march? It's rather anachronistic in this context to defend a capitalism that's going to wipe even neo-fascists out. Okay, so you have carbon still being prolonged in the global energy mix despite climate science, despite slowdown of demand, etc. Very briefly, and major climate shocks registering. Trump, in his tenure, really put the US on the top of exporting and extracting carbon globally, building on Obama's legacy, actually. Bolsonaro and so on are engaging in genocidal violence and destroying the biodiversity of the Amazon, 140 billion tons of carbon being released to slash and burn appropriation. In South Africa, our carbon ruling classes are also committed to coal. It's in our national IRP. They want fracking, and now it's all about the offshore gas and oil extraction game in the reconstruction and recovery plan. So carbon criminality runs deep within and amongst carbon ruling classes. Okay, I can't see. Okay, sorry. Despite the doomsday clock. So there's a self-destructive logic of ecocidal capitalism. It's patently clear. And it's going to be very interesting how Biden, because Biden comes back with the Janus-faced approach to climate policy, actually. And that's really what Obama was all about. There's some continuity there. But it's going to be very interesting to see whether they go beyond that, given climate science, given the shocks registering in the United States, given that most Americans actually believe the climate issue needs to be taken seriously. In this context, Africa is the imperial subject of the global north, has been captured by lumpen bourgeois interests, including in this country. And there's an unraveling going on our continent, actually. It is estimated that 200 million Africans will be displaced by worsening climate shocks and breakdown. And of course, the kind of right-wing nationalisms, the neo-fascisms, whether it's Fortress Europe, Prison Complex USA, all designed to keep out the barbarians in inverted commas, are really not going to be able to sustain this kind of response. My argument here is that we are seeing what I call the rise of 1 degree Celsius movements, whether it's Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, including our own Climate Justice Charter movement. And so these movements are, if you like, at the frontiers of a new cycle of resistance globally. And these movements are going to strengthen because climate is going to worsen, temperatures are going to go up, and middle classes, etc., are not going to allow themselves to be collateral damage by irrational and eco-fascist ruling classes. So there's potential for mass realignment of forces around the most dangerous contradiction we face, the climate contradiction. So it's in this context that we need to think about the politics more deeply that is bringing to the fore the prospects for democratic eco-socialism. So we've had the symbolic disruption of Fridays for Future and the children, and they've raised the alarm bell of climate science very loudly, and climate science has raised their discourse as well very loudly. We have tactical disruption to try and gridlock circuits of carbon, extraction and other extractivist circuits. You know, McDonald's, Walmart, Subway, all implicated in the slash and burn agriculture in the Amazon, the Ende Gelände movement occupying coal pits in Germany. But we're also seeing a shift in climate politics towards strategic projects. And this is what Bernie's Green New Deal was all about. And it's left to be seen whether that translates into the Biden agenda. Okay, it's highly contested, it's uncertain, etc. And then, of course, we have the Climate Justice Charter process in South Africa, which is also envisaging a political project. I mean, our premise is that we can't lobby our way out of this problem. We cannot lobby carbon ruling classes to solve this problem. They're not going to solve this problem. So we need a political project. And that's what the Climate Justice Charter is all about. But crucial here is to use the climate crisis and climate justice to win space for greater sovereignty, for delinking, and if you like, for resistance to eco-imperialism or eco-fascist imperialism today. At the same time, there are crucial democratic systemic reforms that we need to build from below, led by the people. And food sovereignty is one of those, the re-agrarianization of the world, articulated by La Via Campesina. But the idea is to at least move in the direction of feeding every community, village, town, and city across the planet through this democratic eco-socialist alternative. And of course, during this crisis, the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign has made its mark on this issue and is further deepening its kind of approach around pathway building in the country. So we're not starting from scratch in South Africa. But there is enough scientific evidence that we need to break with the globalized carbon-based food system, International Panel on Biodiversity, the land report by the International Panel on Climate Change. So the bottom line is that, if you attack the carbon-based globalized food system and break with it and rupture with it, you're actually addressing the climate crisis, but you're also building the next democratic food system. And so it brings us to this point about the horizons, the ecological horizons of contemporary socialism. And basically the ecological horizons of contemporary socialism will intersect with more biological disasters because metabolic rifts are deepening. Climate is going to impact on pandemic spread as well. Global heating is going to be another crucial challenge. Climate shocks, worsening inequality, and the human impulse to live. And so the global commons, the background condition, water, land, biodiversity, oceans, the biosphere, are all going to be implicated in the revenge of nature against capitalist ecocide. So we are not thinking about socialism at the beginning of the 20th century. We are thinking about socialism in the beginning of the 21st century, where these fault lines and contradictions are going to be defining of the socialist imaginary and if you like, vision and politics. So the infinity of nature and the finitude of the human will define the next period of socio-ecological history. And it is at this confluence that democratic eco-socialism will learn more deeply from indigenous earth traditions to advance life, reject productivism, and affirm a de-alienated relationship with nature. So what are we talking about here? We are talking about a positive humanism, and a humanism that is not anthropocentric, a humanism that understands our relationality with natural relations and so on. This is what Marx called for actually in the economic and philosophical manuscripts. But in the end, we are talking about a slower world. We are talking about a world operating within the metabolic cycles of nature. And this world is possible if we fight now. It will not be possible in 10 years' time. It will not be possible. We will not have this conversation in 10 years' time. The moment is now. And so if we breach 1.5 degrees in the next decade and move towards 2 degrees, we are getting closer to runaway global warming, the end of our species. So there is an alternative. It's been in the shadows because of colonialism, neoliberalism, and imperial violence. We need to reclaim that alternative. And so my contribution then is that we are on a different terrain of struggle. We have to recognize that it is an all or nothing struggle right now. And the balance of forces are such that capital, while having the strategic initiative, is actually destroying itself. But we can't wait for that destruction of capital because the destruction of capital is happening in a way that will destroy all of us. Okay. So that means we've got to fight. We've got to fight in a way that ends capitalism. But we got to do it in a way that doesn't inaugurate further barbarism. We're going to have to hold it together while everything is falling apart. That's the challenge of our time. Thanks, comrades.